Whatever it takes. That's what the video has asked us to do. Whatever it takes. Well, as we announced our goal earlier in the service, all it will take for this church to reach the goal of $2,500 is for each family to give an average of $32.47. Again, understand that some families might not be able to give as much. Some families may be able to give abundantly more. Each family is different, but on average, a family giving $32.47. One thing I was thinking of towards the end of this video, as each person who is of a different age was saying, it's up to me and my generation to do whatever it takes to make sure the gospel continues to spread. I've often heard it said that we need to focus on our youth and our children because they're the future of the church. I don't necessarily agree with that. You know, I understand what they're saying. I mean, honestly, the senior adult generation, they're in their latter years. The middle adult generation, they're moving towards the second half of their years as well. And so, the ones who have the most years ahead of us for the life of the church are the youth and the children. But that's not what the Bible says is the future of the church. Each and every one of us are the future of this church. When you look at Titus 2, there's an expectation that the young adults be mentoring that the senior adult women be mentoring the young women within the life of the church. That the senior adult women who are grandparents and great-grandparents are teaching the young women how to be parents so that they can raise their children to love Jesus and to be a functioning part of the church. So too, as they made apparent in this video, that the giving of senior adults now, the giving of middle-aged adults, the giving of young adults, the giving of youth and children today, all together are planting seeds of the gospel to make sure that the church continues and make sure that the gospel continues to spread to all nations. So I understand the mindset. We've got to focus on youth and children because they're the future of the church. And to some degree that makes sense, and I understand it, but it's not necessarily right. For this church to continue in the future, we need more than young adults, and we need more than youth and children. We need people of all ages being faithful to the call that God has given them to make sure that this church and every other church in the gospel continues to thrive from here until the day that Jesus returns. Whatever it takes. Again, for us, $32.47 per active family unit in the life of this church. Is taking the gospel to all nations, to all peoples, even peoples here among us within the United States and Canada. Is that not worth sacrificing $32.47? And again, maybe your family doesn't have $32.47 to give, but we must remember the widow that Jesus talked about, who gave less than a penny, yet was praised, honestly, for all eternity because it was recorded in Scripture, but her act of giving was praised not because of the monetary value, but because of the sacrificial value of that donation. So maybe you say, I looked at all of my finances, there's no way that I can give $32.47. But what can you sacrifice for the gospel? What sacrifice can you make this month to give to the Annie Armstrong Easter offering? Now, for many of you, today you might be very confused and wondering what in the world I'm talking about. What is an Easter offering? Who is Annie Armstrong? And what in the world does this have to do with my life? Well, I look forward to answering all of these questions for you today. And to be honest with you, even growing up in a church that supported the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, the Annie Armstrong Easter offering, and some of the other offerings we Southern Baptists like to take up, and even working in these churches as well, that honestly, up until this week when I began to prepare for this sermon, I knew very little to hardly anything at all about Annie Armstrong, other than knowing that we had an Easter offering named after her. I was taught a lot about Lottie Moon and the sacrifices that she made for the Chinese people and for Southern Baptist missions but little was taught, at least to me, about who in the world Annie Armstrong was. So this morning we're going to look at three things as we enter into this Easter season, and into our Annie Armstrong Easter offering season. We're going to look at who is Annie Armstrong, what in the world is the Annie Armstrong Easter offering, and then lastly, how should I respond in light of Annie, in light of the Easter offering? What difference does this make in my life? First of all, who is Annie Armstrong? Annie was born as Annie Walker in 1850 and lived to the ripe young age of 88, dying in 1938. She was not a missionary on the field as Lottie Moon was. As we remember from Christmas season, Lottie served for the vast majority of her life, even being a martyr for the gospel to the peoples in China. But while she was not a missionary in the field as Lottie was, she was just as integral to Southern Baptist missions and honestly to the state of the Southern Baptist Convention as a whole today. She was not out on the mission field, but she had just as much or more to do with missions in the Southern Baptist Convention as those serving on the field. And one thing that I never knew until studying this is that she was honestly one of the architects in helping shape the Southern Baptist Convention as we know it today. In fact, many Southern Baptist historians refer to her as one of the leading and premier architects of the 20th century convention. Annie was primarily known for her role in helping form the Women's Missionary Union, known as many of you today as the WMU. Now, the WMU in that day was very different than it is today. They were very integral in taking the gospel to the nations and helping form and support both the International Mission Board, which is known by its acronym IMB, and by the North American Mission Board, which is known by its, which is known as NAMB, N-A-M-B. So the IMB and NAMB. The WMU was full of ladies committed to supporting missions, sending missionaries, and training children to be missionaries as well. While the WMU today still technically still does these same things, the success of the WMU during Annie Armstrong and Lottie Moon's time was honestly kind of their own enemy. These ladies, whose lives were so committed to the gospel, did such a good job at raising funds for missions, at supporting and sending missionaries for the IMB and NAM, that both agencies got such a good and strong foundation that the WMU is quite frankly not as important today as it was then. Now for you ladies who grew up in WMU, I'm not saying that WMU is not important. The WMU in many churches still plays a vital role, but primarily more along the lines of how women can be missionaries in their local field. In that day, the WMU was almost solely responsible for raising money so that Southern Baptist missionaries could do nothing but preach the gospel in the mission field. Today, if the WMU sunk and went under, yeah, technically the Lottie Moon offering, the Annie Armstrong offering, those are WMU ministries, but there's such a good foundation that even if the WMU went under, churches would still continue to give. They're supported by the cooperative program. There's numerous ways for these ministries to continue. And folks, the changes that I'm saying about WMU is not saying anything bad about the ministry today, but I'm trying to focus on how good of a job and incredible of a job these ladies were back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Their work is indispensable to the church today and to the gospel ministry. After the WMU was started in 1888, Annie became the first corresponding secretary, a position today known as the executive director. She served in that position until 1906, when they forced her to take a salary for her full-time work. She refused to take a salary for the work she was doing, so she stepped down and let someone else do it. Annie was also integral and was the lead force in starting the Christmas offering, known today as the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, in 1888, when she implemented the motto, "Go Forth." And if y'all remember back from Christmas, she started the Lottie Moon Christmas offering as a means of raising support to get other missionaries to China to help an aging Lottie Moon. During her 18 years as corresponding secretary, Annie was a tireless worker. She was constantly writing letters to our deployed missionaries in support of them, and writing letters to agencies, churches, and Christians across our nation, building support for our missionaries. In fact, I found this to be shocking. In one year, in the late 1890s, I think it was 1898, that Annie hand wrote over 18,000 letters. Again, they didn't have typewriters. They didn't have computers. Today, you don't even have to use your fingers. We have voice technology. We can speak into a microphone and the computer writes it for us. She hand wrote 18,000 letters to missionaries and to churches in support of those missionaries. Now, assuming that she only worked 6 days a week, she took Sunday off, that would be 57.5 letters per day that Annie wrote in support of missions. Quite frankly, that's amazing. What jumps out to me is that that had to be a job that wasn't very fun. I can't imagine how many hand cramps she got over and over writing 57.5 letters per day. But Annie's life was not about doing things that were fun. Annie's life was about serving and doing what was necessary to advance the gospel. And she was fulfilled not by finding things satisfying and fun and happy, but she was fulfilled and satisfied in doing what was necessary to advance the gospel. Just as the sacrifices that we saw Lottie make on the field in China, yes, Annie's sacrifices were different, but they were sacrifices nonetheless, and sacrifices that were just as important. Annie once traveled 3,300 miles in a 21-day period. Of course, without a vehicle, because this was in the late 1800s, visiting 26 different churches in 19 different cities, meanwhile refusing to let the WMU reimburse her for her travel expenses. Lottie, in addition to writing her letters, was a prolific writer of curriculum. She wrote leaflets for the WMU. She started a young people's scripture section in the Sunday school Sunday school publication known as Kind Words, and also wrote a column along with 2 sections in the teacher's edition of that curriculum. Additionally, she frequently contributed to 2 mission publications, 2 journals on missions called the Foreign Mission Journal and Our Home Field. One Southern Baptist historian said that they have no idea the role she played in raising money for foreign missions, championing home missions, and advocating a Southern Baptist Sunday school ministry. And he ended with this. He said she was a tireless denomination builder. So how did Annie Armstrong get this passionate about missions? How did Annie get this passionate about the gospel of Jesus Christ and doing whatever was necessary to make sure the gospel advanced? Now, you parents and grandparents, y'all make sure you listen up to this. Annie went with her mother to the missionary meetings of the Women's Mission to Women, which was the precursor to the WMU. And it was there, with her mother and other women and children who had been drugged along with her, that she learned how important it is to give to and pray for missions. It was there at this church meeting that she was drugged to that she developed a heart for missions. Now, parents and grandparents, don't think that it is pointless in forcing your children to attend church with you. Annie Armstrong, she did not receive Christ as her Savior until she was 19, which means as a child, when she was being drugged to these missionary meetings, she was lost. She was not a believer of Christ. She didn't have a heart for missions at that time. She didn't care about the gospel. She didn't care about seeing the glory of God spread among the peoples. She was just forced to come with her parents. But there was a seed planted in her heart. In a heart that probably didn't want to be there. A seed planted of the glory of God. A seed planted of the glory of God spread across the nations. A seed planted for the need for the church to step up and be the church and do what God has called the church to do to make sure the gospel spreads. And at 19, when she gave her heart to Christ, that seed began to sprout. And the gospel and a desire for missions became firmly planted and rooted in her heart. But it was the seed of parents dragging them to church when they didn't want to go when that seed was planted. I'm so grateful for my own parents. The number one argument I got in my parents was not necessarily what I could do on the weekends, but the fact that I didn't want to go to church. But I didn't have an option. I hear today from so many people saying, hey, it's just so hard to get my kids up. My dad never had a hard time getting me up. He'd come in, cut the lights on, and say, don't make me come in here a second time. And I knew what that meant. Me and my brother got up out of bed and we got ready for church. It wasn't an option. And the gospel, even when I was in the nursery and in preschool and in children, the gospel, the seed of the gospel was planted into my heart. And at 13 years old is when that seed began to sprout and became rooted in my life. But even then, as a teenager, I still didn't want to go. It was more fun sleeping or more fun being at home watching football or TV than sitting there listening to some man preach for 30 to 40 minutes about the gospel. It's not fun for a child or for a youth to sit still and listen. But my parents didn't care because they knew better than I did. And they knew that the Bible knows better than I did, so they didn't give me an option. So parents and grandparents, don't get discouraged. Learn from Annie and her testimony that bringing a child to church, whether they want to or not, a seed can be planted in their hearts. God used those meetings to plant a seed inside Annie's heart that would lead to shaping the nation's largest evangelical denomination and shaping the most powerful, effective, and efficient missions agencies the world has ever seen. The faithfulness of a mother. So what is the Annie Armstrong Easter offering? We've seen who Annie Armstrong is. What is the Annie Armstrong Easter offering? Just like the Lottie Moon Christmas offering went to foreign missions, the Annie Armstrong Easter offering goes to North American missions. I know that technically Mexico is part of North America, but they consider Mexico with the IMB and NAM just focuses on the United States and Canada. Every penny that you give to the Annie Armstrong Easter offering goes to fund missionaries currently serving and to send out new missionaries. In fact, 25% of everything they receive, everything NAM receives, goes to training young missionaries. To our high school and college and young adult people interested in missions can serve as student missionaries over the summer. They can serve as interns. They can do as Hillary and I did. And our first 2 years after getting married, we served as what's called a U.S. C2 missionary. The U.S. stands for the U.S., the C stands for Canada, the 2 stands for 2 years. They didn't have a very creative name, but we served for 2 years kind of as an entry position into missions. The IMB's equivalent of that is called journeyman. But 25% of everything goes to training missionaries, whether they're high school, college, young adults, to be sent out to a career on the mission field. For both of these agencies, their primary means of income is through these 2 offerings. The other main form of income for them is through what's called the cooperative program. The cooperative program, as those of you who grew up in Southern Baptist churches may know, is exactly what it's called. It's a cooperation between Southern Baptist churches. You see, we understand in the Southern Baptist Convention that we can do more together as a whole, cooperating together for the gospel, than we can do individually. So most churches give a certain percentage to the cooperative program, and most of them give somewhere around 10%. Our church goes above and beyond that, and we give 16% of all of our general budget tithes and offerings to the cooperative program. Now, of that money, of that 16% that we send to the cooperative program, 50% of that goes to the Kentucky Baptist Convention, funding missions within the state of Kentucky. The other 50% gets forwarded on to our national agencies. And of that 50% of that, and I'm going to break all this down for you in a minute. I know that I'm throwing out a lot of percentages. But of the 50% that goes to the national agencies, 50% goes to the IMB and 23% goes to NAM. So how does that look when you give? Of every dollar that you give to the undesignated general budget, we give 16 cents to the cooperative program. 8 cents goes to the Kentucky Baptist Convention. 4 cents goes to the International Mission Board. And 1.84 cents goes to the North American Mission Board. And of the 3.16 cents left, it is split between our 6 Southern Baptist seminaries and the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission. Now, as I mentioned before, Hillary and I were actually directly supported through the cooperative program and the Annie Armstrong Easter offering for our first 2 years of marriage. We got married in May of 2007. 3 weeks later, the first week of June, we packed up and we moved from southern Alabama to Dayton, Ohio to serve with the North American Mission Board from June 2007 to May 2009. But then even in my first 2 years in Columbus, Georgia, from 2009 to 2011, I wasn't with NAM, but I was a missionary with the state of Georgia. So the Easter offering didn't support me, but cooperative program money that was given to the Georgia State Convention supported Hillary and I for another 2 years. Our job during those 4 years was to plant churches among the unchurched. Our focus was low-income multi-housing communities where there was a 95 to 97% unchurched rate. It was in these communities that I would go day in and day out and start building relationships and teaching the gospel and starting Bible studies for the purpose of becoming churches. While I was in Dayton, I also worked among the other churches in the Greater Dayton Association of Baptists, teaching and training and partnering with them for them to go out in their communities and do the same. In fact, there were 2 churches who bought into this full force, and they went out and they started 2 churches in low-income apartment complexes there in Dayton. I checked back with them about 1.5 years ago, and at that point, those 2 ministries were still functioning, and those 2 churches were still serving in those areas. While I was in Georgia, I served in 3 primary apartment complexes. The first was called, of all names, Terminal Court. It was a name fitting for this community. This was one of the most low-down, nasty, and impoverished communities I had ever seen. While visiting there, I met a young lady named Coco, and her mother and her aunt that desired to know the Lord. So I began to have a weekly Bible study, teaching the gospel in their apartment. They would invite other ladies and children to come hear the gospel as well. So every week I would go into their apartment and teach a Bible study for the purpose of sharing the gospel. And 2 or 3 days a week I would go in there and visit and walk around this community that's filled with drugs and prostitution and crime. And I would go around just praying for people, meeting people, visiting with them, inviting them to the Bible study, and evangelizing the residents. While visiting one day, I met 2 brothers, Charlie and a man named, or a man known throughout the community as Cold Beer. I quickly built a relationship with both of these men, Charlie and Cold Beer. Cold Beer was well known on the streets and was looked up to and revered among the other men on the streets. I built a strong relationship with both of them, but especially among Cold Beer, it was under the condition that I not acknowledge him when he was around his other group of friends. If it was just him and Charlie, or just him by himself, I'd go into his apartment, we'd sit there and talk, we'd do whatever we wanted to do. But when the other boys were around, I wasn't to acknowledge him, and I abided by that. But one morning, around 10 o'clock, I normally went out before lunch to do my visits, because that was the most likely time that I would find people not drunk. Unfortunately, that morning I was too late because Cold Beer was already very intoxicated by 10 o'clock in the morning. But this particular morning was one of the mornings he had no friends around. So he asked me to follow him back around to the back of the apartment complex, which right next to it was a wooded area with the train track. He didn't tell me what for. He just asked me to come along with him. Most of them called me Pastor James or Reverend James or whatever, but he called me to go back there with him. I knew he was intoxicated. And even in serving in these communities for 3 or 4 years at this time, I honestly never really got scared. The Bible, the book of Matthew chapter 10, calls me to fear the one who can destroy both body and soul, not those who can merely destroy body. So I rarely was scared going into these places. God called me to do it. I knew He would protect me. But at this point, when Cold Beer, intoxicated, brings me around to the back of a building where no one else can see, For the first time, I began to get a little worried. As we got to the back of the building next to the train track, I began to think, well, God, I guess this is it. But at that moment, Cold Beer turns around, holds both hands out to me, and says, Brother James, I need you to pray for me because I want to change. He then proceeded to divulge some private information to me, information that only his mother and siblings knew, no one else. He proceeded to tell me what his actual name was. His name was Ronald. And he wanted me to stop calling him Cold Beer. He wanted me to call him Ronald. Again, as long as he wasn't around his friends. He did allow me to begin acknowledging him around his friends, but when I did, I still had to call him Cold Beer. And there were a few times I'd gotten so used to calling him that when I saw him in private, he'd correct me and say, no, I'm Ronald. Remember, I want you to call me Ronald. You and my mom can call me Ronald. Nobody else can. Now, I don't know what's going on with Ronald and Charlie today, but I still pray that the gospel seed that was planted is being watered today. And I so pray that I'll meet Ronald and Charlie again one day in heaven. Folks, this is where your money's going. It's going to men and women who are willing to take the gospel to those who need the gospel. Even in places like Columbus, Georgia, where there were 50 Southern Baptist churches in that city alone. We have one. We had 50. We didn't need more Southern Baptist churches. But nobody was going to the government housing projects and taking the gospel to them. Not even the African American churches were going there. So the North American Mission Board said, we want to go there. And they sent people there. And they're doing that today across the nation. But just in general, maybe the normal churches where they have a church building, not going inside low-income apartment complexes, they've shifted their focus to the Northeast, to Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and out west to Washington and Montana and Oregon and Nevada, places where there's the least amount of evangelical Christians there are. They want churches and the gospel spread there where the gospel needs to go. The North American Mission Board is going into and reaching people who have no church, where there is very little Christian presence there. At another complex in Columbus is a small 18-unit complex called Mellon Street. The slumlord there wouldn't even give them heat. So during the winter, none of the 18 units had heat. Numerous times I walked into the apartments to see mattresses on the floor and roaches crawling around everywhere. Just despicable and unbelievable living conditions. But there I began a small Bible study with about 7 or 8 women. Of those, 5 women ended up giving their life to Christ. One day at Bible study, an unsaved lady told me that I could attract more people to the Bible study by bringing food and feeding people. The other ladies immediately spoke up and said, Brother James, other churches come in here every week and feed us. You are the only one who's coming in and teaching us the Bible. Don't worry about food. You just keep teaching us the Bible. There were men in these communities who do the exact same as Ronald and Charlie. They were happy. They knew the life that they were living was wrong, and they wanted their girlfriends and their children to live a different life. They knew their girlfriends and children needed the gospel, and they actually sent and sometimes forced them to go. But they themselves wouldn't go. They'd immediately lose their street cred. And so again, anytime nobody else was around, they'd usher me into the apartment complex, and a lot of times share their whole heart with me. These strong men, in jail, out of jail, in tears on the couch, crying as they reveal their hearts and their life to me. In another complex at Wilson Government Housing Projects, this was a 413-unit government housing project, one of the worst in the whole city. Again, I had one of my larger studies there. We would sometimes have almost 30 people, again, primarily women, coming to this study. But again, I'd go to this community 2 or 3 times a week and meeting people, praying for people, visiting with them, evangelizing them. One particular time I ran into 2 young men who were probably in their late teens or early 20s. They were drinking. They had marijuana in the other hand. I approached them, began to talk to them, began to share the gospel with them. And as happened, the vast majority of times that I did this, those men would leave thanking me for teaching them about the gospel. And I'll never forget these 2 men, because they told me, they said, thank you for teaching us this. When anybody else comes in here, they just get mad at us and tell us we're wrong and we're going to hell. Say, but man, you came in and you showed us how we needed to change. Now, the interesting thing is, at this point, I was already following the way of the master evangelism strategy, which is completely predicated on showing people that they're sinners and going to hell. But instead of just telling them you're going to hell for the life you're living, I followed it up with the gospel and told them how they could change. So they said, thank you. Everybody else comes in here and just says, y'all are sinners and going to hell. I did the same thing. But I spoke the truth to them in love as I presented the gospel. No, I never saw those two men again. In fact, no male at any time in my ministry ever accepted Christ in front of me. Women and children did, but no man did that I know of. Even among internationals within the nation, the North American Mission Board is taking the gospel to the many internationals who are moving here so that they can lead them to Christ, so that those internationals can then take the gospel to other nations, back home. The North American Mission Board is more important today than it has ever been because of this very reason. That giving internationals the gospel, teaching them, and sending them back home to their own people. And folks, you have the opportunity to support this today. You have the opportunity to give and send missionaries out onto the field to take the gospel to a lost and dying world. And lastly, quickly, how should I respond to this? Was your life firmly planted and rooted in the gospel, as the theme of this Easter offering instructs us? Or is it rooted in the things and cares of this world? Would someone outside your life who's viewing your life describe you as being rooted in the gospel? Many people may say, well, I'm already giving so much to the church, I'm giving to these other agencies and organizations, I can't give anymore. And folks, maybe that's the case. But consider something with me. Luke chapter 14, verses 26 and 27 says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and his wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Jesus says that for us to be our disciples, that our love for him has to be so supreme that our love for our mother, our love for our father, our love for our spouses, even our love for our children seems like hate compared to the supreme love that we have for Christ. If our love for Jesus makes our love for those closest to us seem like hate, what does it say about our love for things like TV, the internet, our phones, new clothes, shoes, getting your hair colored every 3 weeks, getting your nails done monthly? I mean, seriously, Jesus said that my love for him is to be so supreme that it's almost as if I hate my wife and children. I can't fathom that. She means more to me than anybody in the entire world. And my 3 children are numbers 2, 3, and 4. But Jesus said my love for him is supposed to lead me. It's compared, my love for them compared to him is like I hate them. But what about my love for TV? If my love for Jesus changes my love for her that much, what does it say about TV and my phone? A few years back, the bills got so tight, the money was so tight for Hillary and myself, is that we had to drop some of the luxuries that we have. Now, some things, such as a Dish Network, I was in a contract, and they wouldn't let me out of it. But what many of these places will do, they put my contract on pause. So for 6 months, it was almost as if I had no contract. I didn't pay bills for 6 months, but when that 6 months was over, my contract picked right back up. But it allowed me to get my feet firmly planted up under me, to get our finances back in order. And for many of you who may say, you know, we don't have money to give, what about putting your TV on pause? Do you really need a data plan on your phone? Do you really need text messaging on your phone? Do you really need the internet? Do you really need your nails done by a professional every month? Now, I'm not saying never do these things again, but what all we're asking for is $32.47. Put the TV on pause for a month, get your nails done for a month, and there you go. You have it. And so what changes? What sacrifices can we make to spread the gospel to the nations? Another way that we will respond is to this is that this church is going to get back to missions education. One of my favorite genres of books are biographies of some of the great missionaries and pastors of the past. I love learning of their faithfulness and having their faithfulness convict me and encourage me in my walk. Folks, we need the lives of these men and women taught regularly to our children so that they can see the great need for the gospel, just as Annie Armstrong did when her mother brought her to those missions meetings. Now, I don't know what that's going to look like in regards to missions education, but it's something that is my desire for this church to get back to doing, and doing very strong. The kingdom of God was supreme in Annie's life and in the lives of the other missionaries. Their lives were devoted to seeing God's will done among the peoples. They sacrificed and gave of themselves so that the gospel could be spread among the nations. What will you sacrifice this month? I almost feel petty asking for only $32.47 when the sacrifice of so many before us was so great. But what will your sacrifice be? It's my question for today. We've got a great legacy lived before us in Annie Armstrong. Her name reminding us of God's call to take the gospel to the nations. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.